Hello, everyone. I hope you're well. I'm Allison Carlson, Managing Director of FP Analytics, Foreign Policies Research Division. Welcome to FP's Virtual Dialogue. Today, we're very excited to explore a fascinating topic surrounding 5G technology. There's been quite a bit of buzz as of late around this issue, but still there's much that's misunderstood. Today, we're going to take a closer look around the powerful technology with the aim of better understanding the risks and opportunities surrounding its rollout, especially with regard to the global competitive landscape and US national security impacts. So thank you all for tuning in and taking the time to be with us today. We'd also like to thank our partner Nokia for helping make this event possible and for their thought leadership on this issue. Today's dialogue will feature an impressive panel of leaders and experts who are steeped in the different aspects of this complex topic, and we'll welcome them in just a moment. But first, I'd just like to start with some housekeeping issues. Before we dive into the conversation, I'd like all of you to participate as much as possible and have this be an interactive dialogue, despite the fact that we're all Zooming in or dialing in by phone. So for those of you using the Zoom app, you'll see at the bottom of your screen a Q&A button. Click the Q&A button when you have a question, and a window will appear where you can submit your questions. And we would really encourage you to submit them as they come to mind throughout the course of the session today, and we'll get to as many questions as possible while we're live. And for those of you dialing in by phone or watching this via live stream, you can also submit your questions at events@foreignpolicy.com as they arise. We would like to remind all of you as you submit your questions to please identify yourself. Please include your name, your organization, and the country or city that you're dialing in from. We'd also like to encourage you to join the conversation on social media using the hashtag 5G Global Power Plays. Now, I would like to start the program. And I'm excited to introduce our first speaker, who will really help us set the stage for this conversation, Brian Hendricks. He's a Vice President of Policy and Public Affairs of Nokia Americas. Brian has more than 2 decades of experience in technology policy, having held senior positions in the private sector, Congress, and with the FCC. Brian is going to speak to us today to help frame our conversation a bit about the geopolitical state of play and give us some perspective on R&D and the aspects and factors that really create a competitive global ecosystem for 5G. Welcome, Brian. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Allison, and thank you to Foreign Policy for having this wonderful event, and to all who are participating. Thanks. I hope we can provide a fascinating conversation for everybody.
Thank you, and thank you again. So to kick us off, as you know, there's been quite a bit of news as of late regarding 5G, and most notably in the last several days, the announcement by the UK that they'll be banning Huawei from their 5G network. Can you just set the stage for us today and give us a little bit of perspective on the overall geopolitical state of play from your perspective?
Well, first I would say that it's a very competitive landscape going on right now. A good bit of the 5G deals have not yet been decided, so competition is fierce. There's a number of markets that have started to look at questions about trustworthiness of suppliers. That's a conversation that's mostly government to government at this point, but it is an intense conversation nonetheless. I think what we've tried to do in our interactions with all the governments where we operate is to highlight our own heritage of 150 plus years of business, and our highly ethical conduct, our transparent governance, and just the track record of lawful conduct that we have, and suggest that that's a reasonable basis to take a look at whether a supplier is ultimately trustworthy, and then to look at questions about supply chain security as well, but to do so from an agnostic fashion. It's in some respects a bit of a distraction to look at this from a country of origin or a particular vendor perspective. We think there's plenty of information available for our operator customers and governments to to take a look and decide for themselves what trustworthy and trustable suppliers ultimately look like. So yes, there's lots of news, there's lots of diplomacy going on. For our part, what we try to do is to frame out for the US government and for other governments who have these questions, how do we make sure that the landscape remains competitive, that you have many vendors that you can ultimately choose from to build your networks. And so we've identified shortfalls that we think exist in the policy of many governments, principally, and I think you alluded to them in your opening comment, is the fact that at least the government of China has spent a great deal of time investing in the vendors, its domestic vendors, and supporting the research and development activities that they undertake. That provides a tremendous advantage. And there's an opportunity for Western governments to similarly invest in research and development across the ecosystem, and to do so, as we've suggested, not just on one technology, and a very forward-looking technology agnostic way. That means investing in R&D for open radio access networks. It means investing in foundational 6G research, and it means investing yet even in key technologies for 5G to accelerate those technologies to market. And we think that is a much more comprehensive way to ensure viability and competitiveness. And then also to take a look at fundamentally what remains one of the key challenges for suppliers like Nokia is that you have, and I'm not suggesting this is in any way unlawful, but you have a tremendous amount of financing that is provided to the Chinese suppliers through their development bank. And that gives them the opportunity to offer very creative financing to operators, particularly in countries where the operators may be struggling financially. And so there's a real need to address, there's a real missing piece, I think, from governments like the United States not fully utilizing their export credit agencies like the Export-Import Bank to be able to provide competitive financing to everyone to ensure that these decisions are not made based solely on who can offer you the longest deferred payment period, but ultimately on what technology you think is best and most trustworthy in your network. So it's about the need for comprehensive policy, not just hard edge diplomacy. And we think there are still some pretty key missing pieces here.
Thank you. That really helps to set the stage. One other follow-up question about that is, often in the media, there are highlights about the US and China and that bilateral dynamic, but where do you see the role of other countries and collaboration in terms of developing a really competitive, robust global ecosystem?
I think it starts with making sure that if you think there is a geopolitical block or a competitive advantage dynamic that's unhealthy in the marketplace, you have to multilaterally work to ensure that you have the tools available to ensure competitiveness. So it isn't just the United States that needs to invest more in supporting R&D for new players, for existing players. It's many governments. So you think about the European governments, you think about governments throughout Asia Pacific. We're still at the front end of the 5G deployment, but we're already beginning to talk about what foundational 6G research needs look like. And there's a real opportunity to make sure that you don't have one government investing heavily in supporting that technology and creating artificial roadmap advantages. You want competitiveness. And to do that, you're going to need to work on a multilateral basis to ensure that you have R&D support. Same is true. Many countries have export credit agencies. Our home country of Finland has Finvero. And many of those export credit agencies are already participating in the infrastructure financing business, but they're smaller. And so frankly, you need more of them to be able to match the kind of scale that exists. But again, every country, every market should have the opportunity to choose from multiple suppliers who are offering cutting edge technology and aggressive favorable financing and payment terms that make the technology affordable. That isn't where we are at the moment. And one country isn't going to be able to alter that landscape. It's going to really need to be something that is done on a multilateral basis.
Great. Thank you. That really helps set the stage and frame the conversation for what's to come. We'll have you back in a few minutes toward
Great.
the end of this conversation as part of our Q&A session. But we'll be diving into a series of conversations now involving infrastructure, the competitive landscape, and national security issues. So Brian, thank you very much. Your comments were really, really helpful in terms of framing that conversation. Thank you.
Great. Thanks. I look forward to the questions.
And now I would like to introduce and invite my colleague, Ravi Agrawal, who's the managing editor of Foreign Policy, to guide our next discussion. He's very well versed in these issues and recently launched his book, which is very relevant to this conversation as well, India Connected, How the Smartphone is Transforming the World's Largest Democracy. Ravi, over to you.
Thanks, Alison, and thank you to Brian Hendricks for those very smart opening framing thoughts. We have some very interesting conversations coming up now. Alison will be back later to moderate a session on the 5G global competitive landscape. And later we'll have a discussion about 5G and national security. But first, infrastructure. When will 5G actually roll out? What will it really accomplish? And which sectors will benefit the most? That's what we're going to look at. And I have two terrific guests to kickstart those conversations. I'm going to ask them to switch on their cameras and their mics now. Jessica Rosenvorsel is a commissioner with the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, where she works to promote greater access and affordability in US communication services. Hi, Jessica.
Hello.
And Michael Murphy is the CTO of Nokia in North and South America. Unrelated, his bio also says he has a black belt, so I, for one, am glad that this event is virtual. Michael, welcome.
Thank you, Ravi. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great to have you both on. Michael, let's start with you. You work on the nuts and bolts of so much of the tech we all use. There's a lot of hype around 5G, of course. Talk us through a little bit of the hype versus the reality of the true potential of this technology.
Sure, and I think to answer that, there's a time element to it. So now we're deploying 5G largely for the consumer use case for mobile broadband, and that's really the bread and butter of the mobile networks business. So that makes sense. But once we get networks deployed, widely deployed, and an uptake in users, and we start getting some money for them, then we can start looking at some of the more sophisticated applications that we often hear about, like autonomous driving, remote healthcare, automated smart factories, and things like that. So that will take a little bit more time, maybe a few more years. Some of them will start early, but some of them have unique requirements, and it just takes time. But if you want so to answer your question more directly, I think 5G has all the technology components to deliver on the hype, more so than the previous generations, but there will be a sequencing to it. Now, if you want a good example of how 5G is different from 4G, if we look at the US and the top 4 operators, the difference between the launch from the first launch of 4G to the last launch was 28 months, and in 5G, it's 2 months. And if we do the same comparison across the US, China, Japan, and Korea, the difference between first and last was 36 months, and in 5G, it's a bit less than 12 months. So everybody believes that this is different. 5G is different. It's going to deliver on the hype more so than any generation previous to it. So that's why we have both this kind of operator race and a country race.
Sure. Jessica, what do you make of those comments? And also, what's the role of the government in facilitating a 5G rollout?
Well, sure. Thank you for having me here today. And I really agree with how Mike was laying out 5G and the sequencing of its future. Because the 5G hype machine is certainly in overdrive. We've got these glossy, well-produced advertisements, public officials lauding this new infrastructure, and technologists talking about what it's going to bring. And I think one of the realities that we need to start understanding is that when we get to 5G, it's different than 4G. It's not just different because its speeds are faster and the latency is radically reduced. It's different because perhaps the least interesting thing about 5G is going to be the smartphone. If the smartphone was at the center of everything with 4G, with 5G, we're talking about connectivity in the landscape around us. Things that will produce driverless cars, instant telemedicine, adaptive traffic signals, better environmental management. There are many opportunities when we connect many more things to be more efficient and more effective. And that's why you see this worldwide effort or race to try to be the first to really scale up this technology. And when it comes to the United States and what I think governments can do, I think you have to look to the skies and look to the ground. By looking to the skies, I mean, we have to think about the airwaves around us and clear spectrum and bring it to market. And not just spectrum, but the right spectrum that can actually have the mix of capacity and signal propagation that can get 5G to more people in more places. We also have to think about how to clear some of the ground for the terrestrial facilities, the towers and microcells that make that technology active. And then I think governments play a role in making sure that network is secure. Because when we connect more things in our economy and our civic culture, we introduce some insecurities and vulnerabilities. So making sure our supply chain is free of insecurities and our technologies are capable of withstanding, what might happen with cyber attacks is really important.
Jessica, I want to dive deeper into some of the points you've mentioned, but before I do that, I just want to also ask you on the infrastructure side, whether rural America stands to be left behind compared to urban centers, just given how the spectrum works and the wavelength of 5G technology works. Talk us through that.
It's such a good question. And I think that candidly in the United States, we should have given a lot more thought to this early on, because our early spectrum efforts for the 5G era were concentrated in high band airwaves, or what's called millimeter wave. Think of that as spectrum 28 gigahertz and above. And the thing to know about that, if you're not an engineer, is that those airwaves have a lot of capacity, but they don't propagate far. In other words, the signal might move from one end of my living room to the other. So you need a lot of facilities on the ground to make that technology viable. And what happens is in urban areas, there's some potential for revenue with that technology. But in less populated ones, it's a lot harder to justify the cost of those resources on the ground. So when we think about getting deployment to rural America or less developed parts of the world, we're going to have to think about the right spectrum that can cover more people in more places with less ground-based equipment. And for 5G, I think the sweet spot is what's called mid-band airwaves. And the FCC's first mid-band airwave auction actually starts tomorrow in the 3.5 gigahertz band. If given my choice, I would have started it 3 years ago. If I had the privilege of a time machine, I would use it, go back and start on mid-band spectrum. And I think around the world, you'll see that's the sweet spot for deployment to get to people who live in rural areas and less populated locations.
Got it. And so in essence, then we may have a situation where some people in urban areas might have a slightly faster 5G than people in rural areas because it's a slightly lower band spectrum. Michael, I want to bring you back in. Given your remit across the Americas, how do you see government subsidizing 5G infrastructure development, and what are the implications for the pace and scale of rollout?
Yeah, that's a good question, Ravi. And, Brian often reminds us that we need a comprehensive end-to-end strategy at a country level. And different regions of the world are subsidizing in different ways, but let me give you a few examples. So in Europe, it's perhaps the largest R&D program in the world, where it's funded by the European Commission and the IT industry of 1.4 billion euros. That was started perhaps about 2 years ago. The China National Key Project funded 5G from 2016. But if we look even more recently, Japan, and excuse me for looking at my notes here, the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry will invest $650 million in Japanese companies, so indigenous companies, to develop 5G. And Korea announced in May 6th also an investment plan for AI and 5G. So you could let 5G grow organically, but because there's such a belief in the hype, there's such a belief that, according to CTIA, 5G will generate 3 million jobs in the US, $250 billion of capital investment, $500 billion to economy. I mean, do you really want that to go organically, or do you want to kind of help it along? So that's what the other countries are doing. So I think there is a role for the government to subsidize 5G in different ways through the entire product lifecycle, by the way, right from the start of research all the way through the great activities that's done by the FCC and Spectrum and site costs and timing, and all the way through to sales, like Brian mentioned, Exim band financing, and finally to where we really want to go, where is having 5G adopted by industry and government agencies.
So there's some good questions you raised there. Jessica, let me put some of those to you. Do you think the United States government can do more to subsidize the industry in the ways in which Brian's describing? Michael's describing, sorry.
Yeah, I absolutely think nations that have a 5G plan are going to do better. And one of the problems I have with the current administration is in April, we were supposed to have a national spectrum policy plan thinking about 5G. It hasn't come out yet. And that was due last April, actually. And I think that when you look at other parts of the world, those that are developing these plans are thinking thoughtfully about what airwaves and spectrum to bring to market. They're thinking thoughtfully about the type of research and development that we just discussed. And I think that planning like that is the most essential element in making sure that a nation is successful. And it goes from early efforts with spectrum, just as Mike just said, all the way through the kind of verticals that can help grow an economy and develop new innovations.
Jessica, you've been quite vocal about net neutrality, and you've said that the FCC, your organization, was, quote, on the wrong side of the American people and the wrong side of history when it rolled back net neutrality. How will the status of net neutrality in the United States affect 5G and its rollout? And do you see potentially that decision being repealed or reversed later?
Well, I think the American people have spoken. They like being able to go online and do what they want and go where they want without their broadband provider throttling their speeds, censoring content, or locking them out of websites. And I think the agency that I work for made a mistake when it chose to roll those open internet policies back. And I do think, and I do hope in the United States we can revisit that decision. I think it was a mistake. But I do have some optimism about 5G because we're going to be able to have much bigger capacities. It is we're talking about gigabit speeds through wireless, possibly, lower latency levels, things that can actually change the way we operate in the world. I think the primary challenge for the United States going forward, though, is to get those available on scale, not just in our largest cities, but as you referenced, also in our rural areas.
Michael, can you compare a bit more how you see in the private sector the United States performing in terms of 5G infrastructure and preparation as compared to other countries? So in other words, which are the easiest places for you to do business and get ready for this new wave of technology?
Well, I guess, the foundation for successful 5G deployment is spectrum. Spectrum, say, is like the air we breathe in mobility. As I think Commissioner Rosenworcel explained that well, the next is siting. So because of the frequencies used, we imagine that there'll be 2 to 4 times more sites required for 5G compared to 4G. And that has a time element to it and a cost element. It's expensive to rent sites. And so we had the siting order and to reduce permits down to 60 to 90 days. And according to one of Nokia's subsidiaries, SAC Wireless, that is actually happening. There was another requirement to reduce the cost down to about $250 annually for site. We see that's not so much happening. So there's a little more requirement there to have it enforced. So those are things that happen in the US that haven't really happened elsewhere in the world. So that's good. But on the subsidizing part, as we just discussed, perhaps the US is a little bit lagging there, but it's not over. We're still at the beginning of 5G, and guess what? 6G is starting as well. So there's still time to do a little bit more for the 5G side to help it advance more quickly than it would organically, and to actually start on 6G as well.
Jessica, once 5G networks are up and running, how much of a delay do you foresee between the networks functioning and companies being able to develop significant value-added technologies on top of them?
That's a really good question, but I don't have a crystal ball right now to tell you. And I do have some concern, candidly, that with a global pandemic ongoing, we are seeing some delays in spectrum auctions, probably some delays in equipment development. Standards processes have, elongated their timelines. And I think that will slow some things down. But I am also confident that when we get this technology in the hands of innovators at scale, we're going to see some really new and radical things that I'm not capable of telling you today. But I think every sector of our economy is going to be affected by this. Nothing will be untouched.
So let me push you on that a little bit then, given that the United States is struggling more with the pandemic than some of its competitors are in Asia specifically, but also in Europe. Are you able to sort of estimate how much of a damage the coronavirus pandemic could cause the United States in comparison with other countries?
Yeah, I actually think that's going to be a global phenomenon because there's so much integration and equipment, and there have been more than, by my estimate, at least 10 countries that have delayed spectrum auctions. I think the United States is in a reasonably good place, though. We are starting a major spectrum auction in the 3.5 gigahertz band, key mid-band airwaves, and it starts tomorrow. So I have some confidence that we're going to still proceed apace, but I think that this will be a global phenomenon. I think we will all be affected by the state of public health.
And just to clarify, the mid-band that you mentioned, how much of an upgrade is that over 4G? And how far behind is it than the highest band of 5G?
Well, the reason I characterize it as an upgrade is that when you're thinking about 5G deployment, you want greater capacity, you also want lower latency, but you want that deployment to also reach as many people as viable. Because the more people you reach, the more scale economies you'll grow for civic and commercial developments. And I think that time has proven that mid-band is the place that you can get 5G to more people in more places from more rapidly. And like I mentioned earlier, I think the United States has been a little slow to realize that. We put a lot of eggs early in the basket of high band spectrum, but I'm pleased that my colleagues have kind of seen the light and recognized that moving to mid-band now is the way to go. Because I think one of the most important things about 5G is not limiting it to the most urban and dense locations. It's not just because that's not democratic or fair, it's because we will reduce the type of use cases we want to see if we don't actually get it everywhere.
Right, and that would also impact how the private sector produces and manufactures its products.
Absolutely, like think about precision agriculture. We could have radical impacts if we start knowing exactly how much fertilizer, moisture, nitrogen is needed in every corner of the soil of a field. We could be more efficient and effective with expensive and environmentally complex resources. We could increase yields. But again, that will take getting really high speed services to some of the least populated places. But when we do that, that sector could grow and it could flourish.
So jumping off of that, Michael, as we look to the post-coronavirus recovery period, whenever that happens, and both presidential campaigns are pushing major infrastructural initiatives right now, which sectors of the economy do you see 5G benefiting the most?
Yeah, that's a good question. And, as a rule of thumb, we haven't been very good at predicting what technology will be used for example, in 3G or 4G, in general as an industry. And 5G will be no different. So it's a bit difficult to predict what will be the first industry that really takes off from 5G, aside from mobile broadband. However, with respect to infrastructure investment, one thing we know we probably should be doing, because we're talking about significant amounts of money here. We typically think in terms of trillions of dollars, right? It's really incumbent on us to do that investment in a smart way, in the sense of having it be 5G ready from day one. So, for example, if you build a road, why not put a conduit in there for fibers so that you can deploy 5G more easily? If you invest in the electrical industry and you have a lot of poles going up, why not have fiber and power to those poles so you can put a 5G small cell on it, and so on. And you might think that's a bit of a crazy idea, but there actually are some countries that are doing it. In fact, our home country for Nokia in Finland, they're looking at some policies like that. So you call it a dig once policy. So I think it makes a lot of sense that as you're investing in infrastructure, if you want to lead in 5G and in 6G later, why not make it 5G ready now?
A good question indeed. We're going to have to leave it there because we're out of time for this segment. Thank you, Michael Murphy of Nokia and Commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel, for your time and for sharing your expertise. I ask you both now to mute yourselves, turn off your video. We would love to have you back at the end so our viewers can ask you their questions. Remember, if you're watching on Zoom, you can send in your questions just by hitting the Q&A button on Zoom and telling us who you are, where you're from, what your question is. If you're watching on YouTube, it is events@foreignpolicy.com. That's email. We will take a look and we will try our best to put your questions to all of the guests who are on today's event right at the end. Lots more ahead. I'm going to be back later for a session on 5G and national security. But for now, I'm going to invite back our very own Alison Carlson and also invite our next guests to turn on their mics and their cameras. Alison, over to you to lead a discussion on the global competitive landscape. Alison.
Great, thank you, Ravi. And thank you for that great discussion to start us off. So diving into the competitive landscape a little bit more and looking around the world, I'd really like to introduce now two guests who are working day to day and deeply in these issues. Elsa Kanya, who is an adjunct senior fellow with the Technology and National Security Program with the Center for New American Security, CNAS, and Chris Pearson, who is president of 5G Americas. Chris advocates for and facilitates the advancement of 5G and the transformation of LTE networks throughout the Americas. And as president of the organization, he represents the third generation partnership program, 3GPP organization, which is uniting telecommunications standards development organizations. And that's one area I'd really like to dive in further during our conversation as well. So welcome to you both. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Glad to be here.
So diving right in and looking around the world and thinking about the competitive landscape, this is often characterized as a race to 5G and a race into new markets around the world as countries are looking to develop their 5G infrastructure, which not only has implications for telecommunications infrastructure, but also all of the technologies that will be built on top of that. And so I'm curious from both of your perspectives, how you see that race evolving, and is Asia Pacific and companies in the Asia Pacific leading in that regard? And how do you see kind of the balance of power and different strategies entering new markets? Chris, I'd like to turn that one to you.
Sure. Yeah, a lot of questions in there. So I mean, and I know we have limited time. So as far as this race to 5G or the race of the 5G industry, it really actually is a race that everyone can win. 5G can be great for not just one country, but all countries throughout the world. And as far as where the US might sit or versus other regions, number one, 5G is the fastest growing mobile broadband technology in history. So all throughout the world, I think we're all doing a good job. And the US is one of the leaders when it comes to 5G, but it's a very competitive landscape, as previous panelists had said. There, when you come to looking at deployments, as an example, the US actually has very robust deployments. If you look at the three national carriers and what they've done with their spectrum portfolios of getting 5G out to the market. When you start to think about the kind of the wider ecosystem of competition, when you start to look at the regions, the US is a very innovative place, as well as many other places around the world. So when you start to think about competition and this race to 5G, we're at the very tip of the iceberg. We're at 93 global deployments or commercial deployments of 5G right now. And we're moving to the year end, given this pandemic, hopefully everything goes smoothly, probably a prediction of about over 200 5G deployments. And if you look at some of the leading regions, you would say the North American market, the Asia Pacific market, and then even now you're seeing even Western Europe, as one of the leaders. But there's a lot going on. There's a lot of prioritization by governments, as the previous speakers had mentioned. And so there is a race going on, but it's a race that actually could benefit really all citizens of the world, especially when you looked at this pandemic and connectivity being, connectivity being king. I mean, really.
Great, that's helpful. Thank you. And also then I turn it over to you. And a question for you is how you see the competitive landscape and factors that are contributing to companies that are able to enter new markets and some of the factors there. From your perspective, are strategies different?
Great questions, and certainly a lot to discuss on this front. I guess I'd start by saying that I worry that all of this rhetoric about a race can be damaging, even dangerous, when it can contribute to a mentality that speed may matter more than security. And it's not just about getting there first or being first to market. It's about really recognizing 5G as a vital foundation for our future societies, our digital economies, and really seeing this as a new kind of critical infrastructure for which the stakes are high. And when it comes to this competition, clearly it is fierce among companies and countries. And frankly, I worry that the US is at a disadvantage increasingly, especially given how we're seeing dynamics play out in light of the pandemic, where the US is still in the throes of the first wave. We are still a long ways away from being able to handle the situation, let alone think about recovery and stimulus more strategically, whereas the Chinese government actually deepened its leveraging of 5G throughout the pandemic, including 5G applications in support of pandemic control and surveillance measures, including 5G-enabled drones and telemedicine being among the prominent features of their response. And here in the US, as well as in parts of Europe, there are still conspiracy theories that 5G may have caused the pandemic, and there's been resistance and backlash to actually building out 5G, even as we see urgent reasons, as we were hearing in earlier sessions, whether it's education, healthcare, or agriculture, 5G could be transformative economically, and yet for all that China may not be winning when it comes to the technology itself, when we look at deployment and the adoption of some of these really impactful applications, the Chinese government is thinking strategically, and they are really sketching out an agenda to build up and accelerate the deployment of 5G at scale nationwide, and with a level of investment that has yet to be matched by any American initiatives that I'm aware of to date, though I'm hopeful we may see more change on that front going forward as the full benefits of 5G start to be more truly appreciated.
Interesting. And it's fascinating to think about that, as earlier we were talking about COVID-19 impacting technology in terms of potentially delaying rollout, but fascinating to think about it in the context of technology development and actually accelerating some of these applications. And a quick follow-up to your comments, are you seeing that primarily domestically in China? Are you seeing that happen elsewhere around the world as well, in terms of the deployment of those types of technologies that then could feed in to this rollout of other 5G related infrastructure?
So I'd say I've looked primarily at the state of play on 5G in a Chinese context, but I'd say that certainly we're also seeing Chinese companies, especially Huawei, remain quite active in marketing 5G around the world. And despite some of the headwinds and resistance over security concerns, it remains the case that Huawei will be a major player within this global ecosystem, and has been contesting markets that don't in some cases see other viable options that are readily affordable. So again, I think there is a lot of talk about this as a US-China race, but I would say that beyond that, within this global landscape, certainly I think other countries, as they think about whether it's new options for pandemic surveillance or trying to look to the digital economy as a source of growth and stimulus in the aftermath of the crisis, I expect that for all the delays, there may also be increased demand and interest in 5G coming out of the crisis.
One of the things, though, we should be careful on is 5G. I mean, again, previous speakers mentioned, we are in the beginning stages of not just the rollouts, but even subscribers taking up the technology. So when you start to look at applications that are being built, if they are looking at helping on the pandemic and things like that, worldwide by this year, we're over 200 million 5G subscribers. But when you go to say 2022 to 2023, you're over a billion and growing fast. So anything that gets developed today to help as far as the pandemic that you mentioned really have to be in the context of 5G. They can be developed for 5G, but they're also most likely, if it's an application or service that can help something with this pandemic issue item or crisis, it would actually also be on the 4G as well, because you look at what's in the hands of basically citizens of the world. They have smartphones, they have devices, or their sensors and so forth.
Related to that, and I'd love to follow up on something that you were saying about the longer term and longer term growth. And something that I think is key to that is standards, or our standards. And given your work, Chris, in standard setting organizations and with those organizations around the world, I'd love to hear from you. And if you could talk us through sort of the state of play for international standards right now that will help guide that longer term development and help ensure international interoperability.
Yeah. Well, luckily, unlike many previous generations, which you go back to say 2G or the early days of 3G, the mobile communications industry really has come together at 3GPP, or Third Generation Partnership Project. And it's funny because it's called 3GPP, but really we're looking right now at we've developed at 3GPP the 5G standards. And that will just continue. It doesn't stop, as Mike Murphy mentioned, Nokia. Things continue to get developed, and already our people are talking about the next evolution. So at 3GPP, you have organizations come together from all over the world. You also have what's called market representation partners, like 5G Americas, that are providing input, white papers, information, again from all over the world. And they actually come together to work on a consensus manner to develop the standards. And so this is not just a few companies. This is hundreds of companies and multiple organizations coming together. And that is to ensure that when the standards are being developed, they are developed for a worldwide global standard that has interoperability and the capability for a device to be utilized no matter where you are, no matter what you're doing, and so forth. So 3GPP, big shout out to them. They have had some delays. Many of your viewers today might have read some of the information about delays in the standards, and that is true. They haven't been significant, but it's been a challenge at times. But most of those delays, typically the delay right now is because they can't do face-to-face meetings, so that slows things down. But they have adopted online virtual meeting rules to continue the progress on the standards. And so they've had some delays, but they're forging ahead on called release 16 and release 17, which are the next two releases to come out.
Great. And a question to both of you regarding the standards is, my understanding is that there is potentially a different approach in terms of preference or the spectrum being used in different markets. And I'm wondering if there is a discussion within the standard setting bodies about that specifically, and what potential risks there may be across different markets if different spectrums are adopted.
Yeah, I'd be happy to take that. So when you start at 3GPP, they do adoption of basically spectrum as far as the different spectrum bands. And so if you go to the standards document at one time, they will actually get support for certain bands throughout the world. And this is done with 3G technology, it's been done with 4G technology, and it actually has been done with 5G technology. So the only challenge to that is a lot of times if you look at the 3GPP standards documents, there are, sometimes 40, 50, 60 spectrum bands that have been adopted. So the risk is that, number one, the risk is that they are accommodating and that there is support for various bands. The reality is in the commercial devices or sensors or so forth, is that you're not going to have that many. It's just physics of what can go into a smartphone. So it's something that continues to be worked on. You need to kind of coalesce around certain swaths of spectrum. You're seeing that with for 5G in what's called the mid-band. The commissioner talked about how important the mid-band is, and it is important. If you look at the mid-band in Asia Pacific, in Europe, and many parts of the world, it has been the sweet spot of providing lots of capacity as well as decent coverage. So, but overall, it is, spectrum bands are standardized, I guess, as far as adoption of what bands at 3GPP. It's also something that comes up at ITU, at the WRC.
And when it comes to standards, I would just add that there's this interesting intersection of the abstruse and technocratic with these broader geopolitical considerations that come into play. And there have been concerns raised consistently over the years that although this process is supposed to be very much oriented towards consensus and collaboration among companies, that in some cases there have been allegations that Chinese companies may have engaged in block voting or even been receiving some direction from the Chinese government as to which standards or which particular elements should be adopted, as was the case for Polar Code, allegedly. And I think that there is increasingly concern within the United States as well as to how to think about standards more strategically, especially when the Chinese government is actively describing their ambition to lead in standards as an important element of trying to achieve competitive advantage for their companies. And certainly Huawei has been a prime example of a company that's in some respects been a very constructive stakeholder in the standards process, but has also been quite forceful, as it seems, in advocating for certain approaches. And I think in the years to come, standards will remain a quite active topic of consideration, especially when we look at initiatives underway within China, such as an initiative that is on track to be launched later this year, China Standards 2035, that's intended to promote these made in China standards for the world and is linked to elements of Beijing's geopolitical aspirations like the digital Silk Road. So hopefully there are ways to continue to reinforce the norms and best practices within standard setting organizations, and because it is so critical, as Chris was saying, to ensure that we do have this really open, collaborative, and interoperable ecosystem around the world, rather than having any fragmentation or seeing a geopolitical competition interfere with the viability of these technologies that have the potential to bring so much good and so much mutual benefit to multiple parties involved.
Absolutely. And thinking about the competitive landscape and some of those geopolitical tensions that exist, I'm curious, the reality is, in terms of manufacturing, supply chains are incredibly integrated around the world. And there's dependence in terms of import or inputs, raw materials, whether they're semiconductors, which is definitely a critical element in the 5G space. I'm wondering how both of you see the trade war or trade tensions impacting viability of supply chains and the competitive landscape.
I'll start out fairly generally. I mean, obviously supply chains are, as you mentioned, no matter if it's technology or getting protective equipment during the pandemic, it's shown that everything is interrelated. So, 5G Americas doesn't dive into trade war issues, I guess, but it is something of concern that there obviously needs to be cooperation to be able to allow supply chains to function. But again, there are obviously geopolitical and situations across the world, that can't be determined by unless you have national security clearance or so forth. So, it is important. I'm again going back to kind of what's gone on at 3GPP with third generation, fourth generation, and fifth generation technology. There has been a way to cooperate on everything, but again, they won't address themselves, trade war issues or trade issues, things like that. Sometimes issues have filtered down into their organization only because of countries not allowing work to be done on standards together. But yeah, it's a big issue. Supply chains are interconnected throughout the world, and I think it needs to be looked at probably more closer of what happens during these crises of trade tensions.
Absolutely. And Elsa, if I could turn that over to you really quickly before we move on to our next session. From your perspective, how are you seeing trade tensions influence the competitive landscape?
Certainly, we live in a world and we have a technological ecosystem that is incredibly interdependent and interconnected. But I think with the state of US-China relations today, we are truly heading into uncharted territory, and that has really called into question many of the foundational assumptions about the risks and benefits of that level of economic and technological entanglement, as we've seen it play out in recent history. And I find debates on decoupling frustrating because often there is not a clear articulation of what the desired end state is, but I think increasingly there is a recognition that whether it is natural or geopolitical contingencies, supply chains can be stressed or disrupted, and it is important to think about options for resilience and diversification and to avoid any asymmetries or dependencies that could be exploited. And I think multiple countries are grappling with these questions, and companies certainly are caught in these headwinds on many fronts. And I think we are starting to see the world as we knew it shift in ways that may be irrevocable on some fronts, and how this new technology and 5G as a new frontier of this digital transformation takes shape against the backdrop of this geopolitics, I think will certainly make for interesting discussions ongoing in the years to come.
Yes, they certainly will. Thank you. And thank you to you both for shedding light on the competitive landscape and some of these issues. There's so much to discuss here, and I wish we could dig in further, but we'll need to move on to our next session now. So if I could have you both please mute your mics, and we'll bring you back again shortly for our question and answer period. But now I'd like to move on to our final segment today, looking at national security, and I will pass the baton back to Ravi. Thank you.
Thanks, Alison. What a fascinating set of discussions so far. Thank you, and thank you to your panelists. We'll have all of you back at the very end for a session answering questions from our viewers around the world. So for now, you can go ahead and turn your cameras off and mute yourselves, but we will have you back. And for our viewers, if you're tuning in, remember you can ask questions at events@foreignpolicy.com or the Q&A button on Zoom. Tell us your name, where you're writing from. We'd love to hear from you. We will put your questions to our guests right at the end. Before all of that, our discussion on 5G and national security. My next guest is Congresswoman Susan DelBene. She represents Washington's 1st District. She serves on the House Ways and Means Committee, and in the past, she served as CEO of Nimble Technology and spent 12 years at Microsoft's mobile communications business. Congresswoman, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Great. I know you were racing back to give a talk, and looks like you've made it, so that's great. Well, let me start by asking you about some of the key cyber vulnerabilities associated with 5G and how you think they can best be managed.
Well, I think first we should realize that a lot of the cyber vulnerabilities that we see today also will exist in a 5G world. And we have to be smart about what we do with respect to software, understand the implications there in terms of security and the constant monitoring that will need to take place. We also have to look at supply chain, and some of the panelists already talked about supply chain, but clearly supply chain risk is something that's been a big focus, but very important, because if there are kind of built-in backdoors or other things in kind of the foundational infrastructure that's in place, obviously that makes it very, very difficult going forward to address, create change, especially if it takes a long time before any of that's detected. So we're going to need the government and private sector to be very engaged to make sure that they're doing evaluation and ongoing monitoring like we have to do today, knowing there are going to be ongoing cyber threats and threats that none of us can anticipate because folks will be innovative in terms of cyber attacks as well. So I think it's going to be across the board in all those areas.
So let me push you a little bit on that, just in terms of solutions and ways in which the government can help. Supply chains for 5G technology can run so deep. there are companies, and then you have contractors, and then there are subcontractors, and then sub-subcontractors further down the supply chain, and you just don't know where they are, who they're influenced by, what kinds of things they can, as you put it, sort of have backdoors into certain chains or software. How do you ensure security across the chain? Give us a sense of the conversations that are taking place, and what do you think, where do you think more oversight and supervision needs to be put in place?
Well, I think standards are important because I think one that kind of brings the international community together to make sure that there's compliance, and so that's one important area. Definitely making sure that we are there is a way to evaluate ahead of time, especially critical technologies. It may not be every component, obviously, to your point, but I think folks also can think of what those critical components, critical pieces of technology are, and that there's a evaluation ahead of time so that there's some idea of mitigation where we can have both on the public sector and the private sector side, testing, evaluation of technologies and products. Nothing will ever be 100%. I don't think you can ever feel like that you're going to have that standard, but there's a lot of work you can do to mitigate, to be aware, to see what's happening in design and implementation of new technologies. And once again, do as much work as you can ahead of time so that we have that knowledge before something's deployed broadly across the country. Second, workforce is very important here. I know it doesn't sound like the key area that people always think about when they talk about these issues, but we need to continue to make sure we're making strong investments in our workforce technology, education, and innovation, because you need, those are the folks who are also going to be the most critical and understanding of what folks are doing and also what to look for when we're talking about mitigation and evaluation from a security standpoint. So we've got to make sure that we continue to look at the R&D and workforce needs that we're going to have for folks who are prepared to do that work.
And do you think the United States is in good shape in all of these fronts? Has it done enough so far?
Well, on the workforce front, I think there's much more we need to do. We continue, you hear across the United States, folks talking about STEM education. Clearly, we have huge gaps in the availability of that education. And in fact, those gaps have probably been are even more perceptible now, given the pandemic, even just basic online learning. I represent a big global technology hub, and you can go an hour from a part of my district that is the home of Microsoft and a lot of technology, and be in a place where we don't even have rural broadband in place, let alone good cell service. And when you look at that in terms of the educational disparities and the opportunities to make sure that we have folks who are prepared in that way, I'd say from an investment standpoint and making sure we have that workforce standpoint, there's a lot more that needs to be done.
So that's the country level you're describing, but then there are sort of other intra-country intelligence partnerships, such as, the Five Eyes. How are Huawei and other security concerns impacting intelligence sharing between countries? Can you speak to that?
Well, clearly intelligence sharing in the end is also based on trust, right? Do you trust that the information you're giving is going to be protected, that it is that there is a network of folks together who share the same values and are also using the same standards for security. So clearly there has to be a agreement, and the Five Eyes have to be on the same page and speaking with one voice, so that everyone feels comfortable in terms of how that information is being shared. I think folks do, but clearly today, but clearly making sure that any new infrastructure, and 5G obviously is the topic, that any new infrastructure deployed meets those same standards so that folks still have that trust. And we saw obviously the UK make its most recent comments about Huawei and kind of changing some direction in terms of deployment of Huawei in their infrastructure. I think it's going to, again, for that trust to be there, folks have to feel like everyone, if they're sharing information, it's going to be safely shared. And so I do think that we have to collectively speak with one voice and make sure we're holding high standards for security.
Sure, and there's trust in governments, and then there's companies. I'm curious, and I'd push you to be specific here, but how can companies and governments best coordinate to mitigate system-wide risks? What do you think they can do more of to ensure that they're partnering better on security?
Well, I think that partnering is one thing. I mean, as much transparency as possible for folks to be able to have a discussion about security, be able to do some of the work we were talking about in terms of mitigation and evaluation and have access to that information. That obviously is key for trust to be built. And when I talk about folks looking at mitigation and evaluation, that has to be public, both on the public sector side and the private sector side. And but competition plays into it too. Clearly, if you are competing and if we have multiple vendors competing, then it's going to be more challenging for a company that is not willing to engage and converse on not only implementation of standards, but also, product development, security that's being used in a place and addressing concerns. I think that's one of the biggest issues right now is that folks feel like there's a very limited supply chain and limited products available for deployment. And when you have that, obviously you have much greater security concerns when you have more control. And then it's also just about kind of what the values are behind that.
So in what ways will 5G be more secure than 4G networks? And in what ways will it be more vulnerable? Can you talk us through the differences and how governments are thinking about this?
Well, one, I think we have technologies that we know are going to be important to use, supporting things like strong encryption, looking at how we can leverage machine learning and artificial intelligence in ways, we talk about the network, but we also have to talk about the devices that are connected to the network. So making sure we have strong standards. We look at, IoT devices, and we talk about standards. I think, when we talk about standards, being at the table on global standards is important. Even having strong policies in place on what happens to personal information, privacy. We even saw recently, with the European Court of Justice decision on Privacy Shield, when we're talking about information, there's and security. Also, there's kind of the individual security from the consumer standpoint about how much do I control my data and what's happening there. We have to have international standards and international conversations there. So, because the security may be a cyber threat, as kind of people think first and foremost, but as a consumer, security might be control of my personal information. And so that's another area that, and I think privacy is an area where we have many more conversations to come, given the European Court of Justice decision, but also in the United States, we still don't have a domestic consumer data privacy standard, something I've been pushing for. The cloud and making sure that we're doing work on the cloud and security there. There have been recommended areas of governance. I know BSA, the Software Alliance, came out with their list of governance issues in terms of making sure we're looking at the software supply chains, the cloud, and governance. So part of that is whether it's standards or other types of governance, it's folks coming together, public sector and private sector, to, it's not a one-time thing, right? This is going to be an ongoing effort.
Let me ask you, if being behind on 5G deployment for the United States, would that have national security implications? And if so, what would those be? So if other countries are operating on 5G networks while the US is still on 4G, will there be significant security vulnerabilities created by that difference, by that lag?
Well, I think when you talk about innovation and competitiveness, then that obviously creates a huge dynamic if we're behind, not only in our ability to be innovative and provide competitive products, but also to be responsive to what's happening internationally. So yes, even from a security framework, it puts you behind in terms of your ability to respond, compete, and be innovative. And we know innovation is also key to security, right? Being ahead, being able to come up with newer technologies, be able to address threats that can come in. And so absolutely, it puts us behind from a competitive standpoint, and that obviously spans from a national security standpoint all the way through to an economic standpoint. So it is going to be important. And we talked, some of the earlier guests talked a lot about key areas of deployment that will be, very, very important. Economically, if we're not able to move forward dependent on others, that also has a impact on national security as well.
And now you're in government, but you've worked in the private sector for so long. And so I'm curious about, just given what you've seen in terms of industry trends, what were the unforeseen national security risks that accompany the launch of 4G networks? And in what ways will those risks with the launch of 5G networks be similar, different, worse? Where do you stand on that?
Well, I think we know that there are ongoing risks. In fact, risks in terms of cyber attacks and other attempts to destabilize networks are going to continue and will continue in an accelerated way, unfortunately. So we know the work that has to be done in terms of looking holistically about networks and what we have to do to keep them secure. It's going to mean kind of taking that perspective, that holistic perspective. Otherwise, I think we're going to continue to always be concerned about 5G deployment. But there's not one moment in time. There's not one particular area that needs to be looked at. We have to do all of these, right? And it has to be on an ongoing basis. It's not going to be at the time of deployment alone. It's also then going to be how do we continue to monitor and maintain networks to make sure they're up to date and reliable. Clearly, having a lot more dependency on software and kind of that constant updating that is on 5G will be there, gives you both an opportunity and a challenge to get new software out there. You have the ability to be constantly updating, constantly getting ahead of threats, but you need to be able to roll that out and develop that to get that out. And that's going to be part of the work that's going to be so important, because you may have been secure yesterday, but are you secure today or tomorrow? That's going to be a constant work that needs to happen, that happens today, but obviously will continue to need to happen in the 5G world as well.
Are you secure today or tomorrow? That's a question that I'm sure many Americans and people around the world will be asking themselves and their governments in the days to come. Congresswoman, I'm afraid that's all we have time for on this session, at least. Thank you so much for your time and your thoughts. But stay with us a few minutes more, if I can, while we bring in our viewers to pose questions to all of our guests today. I'm going to ask all our other guests and Alison to now switch on their cameras and their mics. And as they reappear back on the screen, I have a poll for our viewers and our participants around the world. It's coming up on your screen now if you're on Zoom. If you're watching on YouTube, you'll just have to follow along. And it's a statement. The statement is, quote, "I believe the benefits of moving forward with 5G rollout with my country's current plan and guidelines outweigh any potential security risks. Agree or disagree?" If you're on Zoom, you can see the poll pop up. Again, the statement is, "I believe the benefits of moving forward with 5G rollout with my country's current plan and guidelines outweigh any potential security risks." So you can agree or disagree, and we should have the results coming up any second now. I'm going to bring Alison back in because she's going to take us through to the end of this discussion with Q&A. But Alison, do you agree or disagree? Where do you stand?
It's a broad question, but I would say a qualified yes. And just echoing comments that were made today from all of our panelists, I think there does need to be a real focus on supply chain integrity and real doubling down in terms of R&D and innovation in this space. And I really appreciated the comments on workforce development as well. I think that's an area that's not discussed often, but it is so important. not only for US growth, but definitely critically important to markets around the world. So really appreciated those comments as well.
Got it. Well, and it looks like on the results from our viewers, and we have several hundred, I believe upwards of 1,000 people participating today. The results look like 53% agree that they believe the benefits of moving forward with the 5G rollout in their country's current plan and guidelines outweighs any potential security risks. 47% think that the security risks are in fact a greater consideration and perhaps urge caution. Well, I've learned a lot from these sessions. It's time for me to say goodbye and hand over to you, Alison, for our final few minutes involving questions from our viewers. Take it away.
Great, thank you, Ravi. And thank you again for joining us, all of us on the panel and everyone from joining us online. It's been a fascinating discussion, and we have a number of questions, all of which we won't unfortunately have time for, but I'll just dive right in. One initially that is from Blake Murray from the International Trade Administration, Office of Western and Northern Europe, and US Department of Commerce. The question is, how do you see the COVID crisis affecting EU member state governments' attitudes toward allowing unsecure vendors access to their 5G networks? Do you foresee a shift away from openness to Chinese technology and a greater consideration of security over the low price point and one-stop shop for 5G Huawei offers? Congresswoman Delbene, I'm going to turn this one to you.
Well, clearly, I think issues of supply chain have been highlighted throughout this pandemic, and the resiliency of our supply chains. If we have single sourcing, it makes there's a huge dependency there that, especially, we kind of think of in the natural disaster standpoint, you kind of think that something will happen in one area of the world and the rest of the world will be able to help make up and help out those who are impacted. In this scenario, we know that folks were using resources to help themselves domestically, and there wasn't always those same resources available internationally. And so I do think that that's going to change a lot of view in terms of how the supply chain, in terms of how countries think about supply chain, especially critical supply chains, and resiliency. And resiliency of supply chain mean maybe I'm not dependent on one single country for supply because for whatever reason, that may not be available, and I need to think about what my alternatives are, or how do I have a backup plan to that. So I think there's going to be a lot of work as we get through this pandemic, a lot of discussions already. We're having a discussion, actually, a hearing on the trade subcommittee that I'm on in Ways and Means tomorrow on supply chains, just because of many of the issues that you're bringing up.
Great, thank you, that's very helpful. Brian Hendricks, I'd like to turn one over to you. I'm coming back into the conversation. And there's a question from Dilip Dekka. Are developers working on applications of 5G already? Or will they have to wait until the networks are in place? Where does that stand in terms of the development trajectory?
That's a fantastic question, and I'm glad it was asked, because I think it's actually another area where the U.S. has lagged in a policy perspective. So we've seen a lot of other countries, India with iCreate, Canada, have been looking for ways to try to bring together the users of the potential technology with developers, with financiers, in incubator kind of scenarios, because what we often find is that the folks who have the need for the technology and the greatest understanding about changes that might be highly beneficial, for example, healthcare folks, they're not developers of applications and coders, and the folks who are experts in developing applications are not familiar with healthcare. And so there are opportunities for the U.S. to create a focus not on the R&D side, on the proof of concept side, but on the business use case application development by providing an environment with kind of a live 5G network for testing and development that can take place even as the larger carrier networks are built in place, but to kind of provide this environment to bring together developers with healthcare, logistics, finance, energy, other entities that may very much have ideas about how 5G can play for them. But in some respects, yes. I mean, some of the application development is waiting on the networks, and I think that that doesn't have to be the case. We can actually provide better environments to bring those people together and accelerate app development.
Thank you for those comments. And your reference to India actually relates to another question that came in that I'd like to field now regarding, it's from an anonymous attendee, but they mentioned that in India, we recently heard that Reliance Industries chairman announced that Reliance JIO has designed and developed a complete 5G solution from scratch. Will this enable them to launch a world-class 5G service in India using 100% homegrown technologies and solutions? The Made in India 5G solution will be ready for trials as soon as 5G spectrum is available. How will this change the competitive landscape in India and around the world? Actually, I'd like to toss this one over to you, Elsa, and thinking about other developments in India as of late and some of the competitive dynamics that have been evolving there. I'd be very curious to hear your perspective on that.
Sure, I hadn't been familiar with that homegrown 5G solution, but I will definitely look forward to hearing more. And I think certainly having more competitors in the landscape is would be great news, and trying to continue to diversify the overall 5G ecosystem by having more companies and countries actively involved in investing, I think is the best way to move towards a healthy equilibrium within 5G market. I would love to hear from folks on the industry side of things as well, but certainly I think when it comes to the geopolitics, we've definitely seen a reckoning within India when it comes to the allowance of Chinese technology, or now a move towards the lack thereof, and certainly arguably the Chinese government has overplayed their hands in terms of more aggressive diplomacy, including the border standoff, and that has really changed the threat calculus and perceptions within India when it comes to the risks of having Chinese technology within their ecosystem, and perhaps more of a shift towards indigenous alternatives going forward. So definitely a lot that will be interesting to see play out going forward on that front.
Great, thank you. And certainly several issues related to spectrum have come up throughout the course of the conversation today, and spectrum availability and competition over spectrum. And so one of the questions that came in from George Jungbuth, and this is for Commissioner Rosenworcel: what is the US government doing well in ensuring we're freeing up spectrum responsibly for 5G? And where should we be putting more emphasis?
Oh, that's a terrific question, because of course, spectrum is the lifeblood of wireless communications, and figuring out how to allocate it in ways that are smart and intelligent is the foundation for everything we're going to do in 5G and the broader economy that relies on it. Now, I think one of the primary challenges is a lot of our airwaves have already been allocated, to older services, broadcasting, military radars, weather balloons, a whole variety of services that are really important to our existing economy, but may not represent the most efficient use cases of this scarce resource in the 5G era. So the challenge for the United States, and I think all governments, is how to carefully and elegantly repurpose some of those airwaves for more modern uses. Because in general, incumbent uses are not interested in giving those airwaves up. And so I think in the United States and around the world, we're going to have to start building policy incentives for more efficient uses of spectrum, both in the commercial sector, but really importantly in the government sector, because there are a lot of airwaves that have been allocated for government uses. And if they're capable of doing those same things on perhaps half the spectrum, we can take some of that and repurpose it for this new 5G world. So I'd like to see more incentives for efficient spectrum use, not just in the United States, but worldwide.
Great, thank you. That's a perfect place to end it. Not perfect in the sense that we have many more questions, but unfortunately we don't have the time for today. I would like to thank all of you again for taking the time to join us. We know you have tremendously busy schedules, all of you. So we really appreciate your perspective and trying to help us sort through what is clearly a very complex and rapidly changing issue. So thank you to you all again. We really appreciate it. And I'd also like to thank Nokia again, our partner in this event, for making this possible. We really appreciate all of your support. And just a few other comments before we leave today. If this conversation has sparked your curiosity, I'd be remiss not to mention a project that we're working on and have been working on within FP Analytics. They're 5G power maps. And it's an effort to distill some of these complexities. And if you are interested in digging further, you can find those power maps, which are available to FP insiders on our website. And you can find those now. They've been recently updated, as we mentioned, and as everyone knows, this issue is changing rapidly. So I encourage you to check those out and reach out if you have any other questions about those. But would love to thank you again for tuning in today and encourage you and welcome you back to our additional series and virtual dialogues. We'll be having another one next week, Profiles in Resilience, where we'll explore how African enterprises are innovating in the face of COVID-19 and how grassroots local development are powerful tools for building not only local resilience, but also greater security. So for those events and more information, you can find those at foreignpolicy.com/events. Thank you all for joining us today. We've really enjoyed this conversation. We hope you have too, and we'll see you soon.